So without further ado, welcome to our Net Zero webinar. At ISO QSL, we are always really keen to put on webinars that add extra value to our database, to our customers, to our clients. And we know that this net zero topic is something that is really key on many businesses' agenda at the moment. It's something we get asked an awful lot about. So I'm delighted to be teaming up with George Richards from JRP Solutions today to bring you this webinar. So to highlight really what smaller businesses, what SMEs can do to focus on what they can do in terms of net zero. Just to give you a really brief overview to start with, so my name's Stacey Hum and I'm from ISO QSL. We are specialists in helping SMEs improve their businesses through management systems, and we offer training and certification for organisations. Our missions and our values are that we aim to make businesses better through standards. And as I said, part of the way that we do that is by adding value to customers as well, not just through standards, but through seminars, webinars like this. And we offer the main standards of ISO QSL 9001, but this one really looks at 14001. And that's the standard that we're going to be focusing on today. I'm your host, Stacey Hum, although it does say Jennifer at the bottom. That's my MD. I'm working on her laptop today. But my name is Stacey Hum and I'm a business development specialist here at ISO QSL. We've got George Richards with us today. He's from JRP and he's going to be delivering this seminar. George has over 35 years experience of working with industrial and commercial clients. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to George. He is our expert here today to talk about net zero. I'm going to turn my camera off and I will be monitoring the questions. So as I said, if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to George.
So we work in partnership with ISO QSL. We have complementary areas of work. Net zero is one of them, of course. So I'm going to just talk you through a little bit about who JRP are, so establish our credentials and a bit of background and context. And then we'll talk about what net zero is and how it will impact, and it already is impacting all businesses, irrespective of size or sector. And here in the UK, of course, achieving net zero by 2050 is mandated in law. So we have no choice but to do it. Whether you believe in climate change science or not is immaterial. This is about business as much as it is about the environment. So I'm going to take you through those points on the screen there. And at the end, as Stacey's already said, if you want to put any questions in the Q&A, and then we'll try and cover as many of those as we can towards the end. Those that we don't get to cover, we will respond separately to post this webinar. So nice to meet you all. Next slide, please. So a little bit about us without boring you to death. We've been around since 1999. So whilst net zero is relatively new, we've been around for some years now. We're the UK's leading independent energy, net zero and outsourcing specialist, which is a bit of a unique blend of skills, but it enables us to act in our clients' best interests. Because we're technology and supplier agnostic, it means that we can always give the best independent advice with no axes to grind, so to speak. Outsourcing is a bit of a specialist area. We've helped companies like Rolls-Royce to outsource all of their facilities management across all their sites in EMEA, so that's Europe and the Middle East, over a 10-year period. And that took out £400 million of costs on an annual basis, but also improved the customer satisfaction delivery, rose from 43% to 91% in that time. So it was done for the right reasons in the right way. But The reason I mention that is because when it comes to things like projects, solar, CHP, ground source heat pumps, things like that, it also enables us to be able to negotiate the right supply agreements, ongoing O&M agreements, energy performance contracts, power purchase agreements, etc., etc. So it is a unique blend of skills, as I say. We all come from a very practical and pragmatic background. So we understand manufacturing processes. We don't look at energy in isolation. I think that's really important. And equally, we don't look at emissions in isolation. We understand that if you take the word sustainability, for instance, it's not just about environmental sustainability, it's about business sustainability. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a minute. We work across all sectors. So food and drink, engineering, chemicals, pharma, aerospace, retail, finance, and I can give you numerous examples from any of those sectors. What we do up until 2017, we were primarily, most of our business was around energy management, helping different organizations to improve their energy performance and manage their energy better. So that could be anything from training to projects to auditing to compliance, ISO 50001, things of that nature. But we began our own transition to become a broader net zero business at that time, because we could see the mood music was changing, particularly coming out of the finance sector, where investors were beginning to make different decisions around where they were going to invest money, what sort of organizations. And that's really snowballed ever since. So we could see that happening, and we transitioned our own business. We upskilled, we recruited, we established a net zero network of specialists as well to supplement what we did. And we are ourselves an ISO 50001 certified company, as well as 9001, of course. And earlier this year, we became a B Corp registered company, which basically means we're doing all the right things for the right reasons from a sustainability perspective. And we also have a net zero target of 2030. Bit easier for a company like ours, to be honest, because our biggest impacts are in our travel. We all work from home anyway, always have done. So we don't have big corporate offices or anything like that, or fleets of vehicles. So it is easier for us, so I'll be open about that. But nevertheless, it shows a commitment, and we don't just talk about it, we do it as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And these are just a few of the various businesses we're working with. We also work with universities. I think we've worked with over 60% of the UK's universities. We work with some NHS trusts as well. But as you can see, there's some familiar household names there. So we work right across all sectors with companies of all different shapes and sizes. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, and I could put up loads of these things. It's always nice when people say nice things about you. It means more when they say it, because I'm going to say it anyway, aren't I? Naturally. But yeah, there's lots of company references and good client affidavits, if you like, testimony to the work we do. We like to work with our clients over long periods of time. We don't like doing one-off bits of work and walking away. That's not the way we are. But we're very flexible in how we work. We're non-prescriptive. So we'll work in whatever way best suits our clients. But Vodafone there, for instance, we've worked with for, I think, 7 years now. We've helped them to get ISO 50001 across their UK data centres. We've delivered energy training. We've done their ESOS audits. We've done waste audits for them. And we're continuing to work with them today. London School of Hygiene, we worked with probably about the last 3 years. And that was all around net zero, which was interesting stuff. Next slide, please. It's quite a slow transition, isn't it? So moving on towards net zero, we've all seen the changes, irrespective of our political views or anything else. The world is changing, it's changing fast. Awareness of climate science and climate change and the impacts it's having on the world. It's been very much raised by the likes of Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough, and of course NGOs such as Extinction Rebellion. Move on, please. And of course, the recent pandemic, I think at the time, I didn't know what impact it was going to have. We were actively talking, I'd say at that time, probably 70 or 80% of our client engagements were all around net zero, which was a big turnaround because probably 12, 18 months prior, it was probably 80, 90% energy related or FM outsourcing related. And I thought when the pandemic happened, one of two things was going to happen. Either organizations say, well, hang on a minute, we just need to survive now. This is about actually breaking even or trying to make a profit in very challenging times. And therefore net zero, yeah, it's a nice to have, but we're going to have to forget about that for the time being. That didn't happen, much to my surprise. Organizations and individuals, and I'm sure many people on this call had the same experience, really reevaluated their priorities. You know, from an organizational perspective, do we really need to have all these offices? Do we need to get our employees to commute in, particularly into big cities like London? You know, they arrive stressed. It adds on another hour or two each end of their day. It means they're not getting a good work-life balance, so they're not necessarily as focused as they should be when they're at work. And in actual fact, it's a big cost to us as a business to keep running all these offices, etc. As well as obviously in some cases paying for people's business mileage and company cars. So it really did help people to reevaluate where they were. And I think we've now got this, you know, hybrid way of working where most people aren't now being dragged into offices. Some people are permanently based from home. Others have a hybrid way of working. That's had a positive benefit for the majority of people, not all, but the majority of people, where they've struck a better work-life balance. They can fit in things around their work life. They're not having that stressful commute to and from work. And from an organizational perspective, they're finding productivity has improved, and employee retention is much better than it was. The general sort of well-being of employees has improved massively. The other thing that it did was also expose the vulnerability of supply chains as well. And this wasn't necessarily in the pandemic, but if you remember when that container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, I don't know whether the captain was trying to do a U-turn or something in a very narrow canal, but he got stuck there for a best part of 2 weeks, I think it was. And that had a massive effect on supply chains and sectors all around the world, because obviously so much goods gets shipped through that canal, and it sort of exposed the vulnerability of the just-in-time stocking system, etc. And some companies decided to strategically make the choice of onshoring some of the manufacturing where that was possible, looking at their supply chains. And that sort of all fed into the whole net zero conversation as well. Next slide, please. And obviously, you know, things are beginning to change. I mean, let's not talk about UK politics at the moment. It's I think today Downing Street are having a revolving door fitted to number 10. It's just getting laughable, but it doesn't help, does it, in terms of business or decision making, etc. But things are continuing to change. And when you've got companies like BP, who I worked for 20 years ago or so, coming out with statements that they're almost painted into a corner because they know that the future of fossil fuels is very, very limited, and they have to change. And interestingly, 20 years ago when I was working for them, we were looking at and trialing hydrogen for transport. We were also, BP were also the second largest manufacturer of solar PV in the world. And then in their wisdom at the time decided to sell that business and decided not to pursue the development of hydrogen. That was a big mistake on their behalf, and I bet they're bitterly regretting it. But the point is, the world is changing. And one of the statements that I like very much around net zero is, this isn't about tree hugging. This isn't necessarily about doing the morally the right thing, or even if you're not concerned about the future of the planet and how habitable it'll be for our children and grandchildren. From a business perspective, it makes sense. When you've got someone like Mark Carney, former governor of Bank of England, highly respected individual within the financial community, when he makes statements that net zero represents the greatest commercial opportunity of our time, boardrooms started to sit up and take notice. He also made another comment on Radio 4 about 18 months ago, where he said quite bluntly that any business that wasn't sustainable won't be in business in 10 years' time. That's a stark warning. And that's why the conversation around net zero has very much continued at pace. Next slide, please. And yeah, I mean, I just put this up because you're not alone in going for net zero. I think sometimes people do think it's quite a lonely furrow to plough, but you've got some big boys out there who are very much pushing this because they know that, you know, for the reasons that Mark Carney stated, they have to do it. And as the human race, we don't really have a choice. If we don't limit global warming, we've already seen the impacts. You know, there's floods going on around the world now. Is it Uganda, Australia, and closer to home as well. It's really, and of course we've seen droughts before that. We've seen wildfires this summer in London, for goodness sake. So, and we've not even reached 1.5 yet. So it's really critical for the future of the human race, not the planet. The planet will survive. You know, this isn't about tree hugging, as I say. This is about, you know, ensuring that we have an environment in which the human race can survive and thrive. That is how important this is. So when you've got companies like Tesco and one of their suppliers, Liberty Wines, doing what they're doing, one, that means that they're taking it seriously. They understand what the issues. They also understand that their supply chains, you think about someone like Tesco, they're getting supplies of stuff from all around the world. It affects their supply chains. It affects their growers to grow things that they've traditionally grown. It affects crop yields. It affects water supply, which affects things like the growing of cotton for clothing. It affects absolutely everything you can think of. And floods themselves can very much affect the supply chain. I remember a few years ago, the automotive industry globally almost came to a grinding halt because the supply of chips, microchips for their engines, were coming from 3 factories, all based in central Thailand, which had been subject to an extreme weather event and was basically 6 foot underwater. So it has an effect, and it's already having an effect. So we have a collective responsibility, both as individuals and as organizations, to limit our impacts on the climate. Next slide, please. And I apologize if I get on my soapbox a bit, but I'm quite passionate about the subject, as I think we all should be. So what is net zero? It's very important to define what it is, because there are some organizations out there that have attempted to greenwash the subject and pretend that they're doing more than they are. But net zero basically means that we have to be net zero emitters of all greenhouse gases by 2050. Now, some organizations have set themselves more ambitious targets, sometimes without doing their homework first. But as a country, as in the UK, we have to achieve net zero by 2050. How are we going to do it is a big question, of course. Next question, please. Next slide, please. So just to explain what greenhouse gases are, those are the 7 main greenhouse gases at the top there. What you'll often find is that when we talk about the environment and greenhouse gases, it's expressed as carbon dioxide, the first one there on the left. But it's CO2 equivalent, because you have some gases there like HFCs, PFCs, etc., which are many thousands of times more damaging to our environment than CO2. So they're expressed as CO2 equivalent, and they're all expressed, they have a factor called global warming potential, GWP. So CO2 has a GWP factor of 1, whereas one of the other ones, and I can't remember which one it is, has a global warming factor of 24,000. So that's why it's important that we measure and we manage and we control all greenhouse gases, because some of them have a hugely damaging effect on the environment. Where do those greenhouse gases emit from? They're split into 3 scopes. So you've got scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Your scope 1 and scope 2 basically are the things that you will see and you can control within your own businesses on a day-to-day basis. So in other words, if you're, say, occupying a factory or a farm or an office, it's basically all the energy that you're importing to the site or you're burning on site. So that's gas and electricity primarily, obviously some oils, etc. Those are your scope 1, scope 2. They account for, and scope 3, sorry, is everything else. So it's everything that you're buying into the company, everything else you're doing, business travel, etc., etc. Now, the split between those, in other words, where are your sources of greenhouse gases? Typically, in most organizations, the minority of those emissions are coming from scope 1, scope 2. So those are the things that you can see and you can control on a day-to-day basis. The majority of your emissions lie within scope 3. So they're within all the things that you're buying in that enable you to function as a business. So bought in purchases, purchase goods and services, for instance, is the largest one for most organizations. But then you've also got things like pensions and investments. So if you obviously got works pensions, whoever is managing that pension fund, where are they investing that money? Because if it's in a fossil fuel company, then you are having an impact in terms of your business and the emissions that you are directly or indirectly responsible for. Now, one of the questions that has been put to me many times is, well, you know, the UK are only responsible. We only emit just over 1% of global emissions. So why aren't we focused on China and India? Well, my answer to that is it's only partially true, because we've outsourced, in effect, a lot of our manufacturing. A lot of our goods come from abroad. 12% of everything that comes into the UK comes from Germany, for instance. But obviously, a large percentage of our goods and services are imported from China, India, the Far East, and America. So you can't outsource your responsibilities, because our choices in terms of what we buy and how we buy it actually impacts global emissions. Yes, they might be being emitted from a factory in China or Indonesia or America, but that wouldn't be happening if we weren't buying them in the first place. And that's the simple reality. Plus, also, it doesn't matter where the emissions are actually being emitted, where that source is coming from, because it's global anyway. It doesn't stay in that country. It goes all around the world, and it affects everything. It affects our water. So if you think about pollution in the sea in Indonesia, that eventually, or in their rivers, eventually ends up going out into the oceans and eventually ends up in our food chain. So it is a global issue, and we cannot detach ourselves from our responsibilities as individual consumers or as organizational consumers. Next slide, please. So yeah, so as I was saying, it's your scope 1 and scope 2 is the things that you see and you feel in control of. And scope 3 seems to be a huge beast that you can't do anything about, but you can. And I'll talk you through how you can deal with those. Next slide, please. There you go. So what are the key drivers for net zero? Well, if you don't get the moral bit of it, you don't care about your kids or your grandkids or the future of humanity. From a business perspective, there are other drivers as well. There's a growing demand from customers and stakeholders. I, like Stacey, live in Worcester, and I've got a colleague who's a vegan, which makes life quite challenging at times. And I went into a sweet shop on the high street expecting to find maybe 1 or 2 choices for vegan sweets. And much to my surprise, there was practically an entire wall of the shop taken up with vegan sweets and confectionery. And I asked the business owner, you know, how come they had such a massive choice? And they said, well, purely because of demand. It's just growing and growing and growing. And it's exactly the same thing in terms of net zero. People are asking the questions, they're making different choices. Unfortunately, in many cases, there's not enough information there to make an informed choice. If you go into M&S, for instance, how do you know how environmentally friendly any item of clothing you're buying or foodstuff is? You know, there's limited information currently, but that is improving. There is also increased reporting. So for those of you that qualify, typically it's anyone that employs over 250 people, are having to report annually streamlined energy and carbon reporting. And every 4 years have to do an energy audit of their business under ESOS. And in Europe, there's the equivalent under Article 8 for ESOS as well. And then there's TCFD, which is about the investment community wanting to understand whether you're mitigating, whether you've understood the risk to your business from climate change and what actions you're taking to mitigate those risks. So that has all happened in the last 7 years. In fact, 6 years. Those reporting requirements have come into play, and it's going to get more and more onerous. You need to be able to ask those questions, even if you don't directly qualify for those at the moment. Your clients will, and they will. It's a trickle-down effect, if you like, that doesn't work economically, but it definitely works in this case, whereby they'll be asking you the questions that they're being asked because they need to be able to answer the questions. So your scope 1, scope 2 emissions, if you think back to the previous slide, are basically your customers' scope 3 emissions. So they'll be asking you, what are you doing to manage your emissions? Where's your net zero plan? What targets have you got? And if you don't do it, your competitors will be doing it. So you need to do it to remain competitive. And there's a way of differentiating yourself from your clients as well, from your competitors rather. We've done some life cycle carbon assessments. One of the first ones we did, funnily enough, was for Ann Summers. And I'm not going to tell you what the product was, but we've done it for a number of other businesses on events, on materials, etc. And the reason why they're doing it is because it's a commercial realization of being able to differentiate themselves from their competitors and say, well, the carbon footprint of our product or our event or whatever it might be is this. That will naturally provoke their client to ask other suppliers, well, what's your carbon footprint? Because we've got a responsibility to manage ours, and this supplier is contributing towards that. What are you doing? So it really is, that's where the competitive bit comes in. But it also, if you think about your scope 1, scope 2, i.e. your energy that you're buying in, the fuel that you're burning on site, the less of that you do, obviously you're going to be reducing your operating costs. And at the moment, with energy prices the way they are, that is becoming, a very, very strong imperative and driver to start on this journey. And it is fast becoming a prerequisite to be a supplier for some organisations. The NHS, by example, have already stated that by 2030, to be a supplier to the NHS, you have to have a net zero plan, you have to have targets, and you have to evidence progress against those targets. Now, the NHS are a massive purchaser of goods and services. So that has a massive impact on their entire supply chain. And likewise, the supply chain to the supply chain will also be making similar demands because they have to back it up themselves. It's a great way of attracting new customers and to retain existing ones. And as I said, in law in the UK, we have to achieve net zero by 2050 anyway. There's no getting away from that. And it's important because you need to become a sustainable business in all sense of the word. This isn't, as I said, about tree hugging. This is very much about actually becoming a sustainable business, both financially and environmentally. And when I asked a question of the MD of Western Cider, which is a local food and drink business based in Ledbury in Herefordshire, why she was engaging us to help them to develop a meaningful net zero strategy for them. And she said, as I put there, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because we are increasingly being asked about it, and we know we have to do something sooner or later. And secondly, this is a family business that's been around for 150 years, and I'd like to think it'd still be around in another 150 years. I couldn't have put it better myself. So that was a really great statement for her to make. Next slide, please. Okay. So how do you get there? Because it all seems very daunting, and I totally get that. But trust me, it's not. We developed, this is in actual fact a 5-step plan, not a 6-step plan, because we don't really do the program charter. That was something that we thought large organizations would want to do. We don't find it necessarily. We cover that off in different ways. But essentially what we do is we do a gap analysis. And what that means is we will come and have a look at an organization, see how they're currently managing their impacts, both energy consumption on site, environmental impacts, things like waste, etc. We look at we do a governance review, so we look at existing processes and procedures, supplier arrangements, things of that nature. And we also do an expenditure-based analysis of your supply chain, because that's your scope 3 in essence. So by the end of that gap analysis, what we have is a very clear picture of what your current impacts are, what your total greenhouse gas emissions are as a business across all 3 scopes. And then we develop an action plan that says, and over the next 3 to 5 years, these are the specific things you're going to do to help reduce that impact. And also in doing so, reduce your costs, certainly around scope 1 and scope 2, and take you that one step further towards your net zero target. Now, you might ask the question, well, why do you only do an action plan for 3 to 5 years when net zero is going to take us a lot longer than that, say 20 years? Well, it's because things change, don't they? If you look at, let's moving away from politics, but if you look at what's happened in the last 24 hours in politics, it's unbelievable. But as you think about technology, legislation, etc., and all the changes that are likely to occur over that 20-year period, it's impossible to set out a meaningful 20-year strategy. Yes, you can have a target to achieve net zero by 2050 or 2040 or whatever date is appropriate for your particular organization. But in terms of an action plan, you have to deal with the here and now. What's practical, what's available, what's affordable, what technology is here now or about to be here that you can deploy to help you to reduce your GHG emissions and take you that one step closer to achieving your net zero ambition. Okay, once you've got that, then it's about implementing it, isn't it? It's about doing it. There's no point in having a strategy and go, yeah, that's nice, got a nice document. Now you have to do it. And we can help you through that process directly, indirectly, just sit in the background, hold your hand. We can help you to find funding for specific technical projects. There's behavior change, there's processes. There's lots of things that can be done. We like to try and encourage our clients to do as much of that themselves, because you should be. It's your plan, you've got to live and breathe it, it's your business, but we will help you as much or as little as you need going forward. Next slide, please. So yes, I've talked about the gap analysis. So that's the real sort of getting to grips with your business. Some of the typical technologies that will help you to reduce your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. There's obviously solar, which everyone's very familiar with. But it's not as straightforward as I've got a roof, let's stick some solar panels on it. It's about making sure the numbers add up, that you get the right panels in, you get the right supply agreement, and that you sense check that it's actually going to perform in the way that it's going to perform. Because if it doesn't, your economics go out of the window. So rather than being say a 5-year payback, it becomes an 8-year payback, or whatever the case may be. So we can help you to review that. We're doing that sort of work with the likes of Domino's Pizza and Severn Trent Water at the moment, where they're looking at all these technologies, and we're helping to say which are the most appropriate, and then helping them to get the right installation in with the right supporting agreements in place. And as I said, where it's required or if there's an interest, we can help you to find finance for that project and still ensure that you get a year 1 saving on your energy costs. You get increased security supply, of course, and it means you're not having to stump up the capital yourself, which is for a lot of organizations in short supply at the moment. You've also got things like AD plant, which is anaerobic digestion, where you can create biogas. You could run CHP from that, so you can create biogas from waste and use that biogas either for heating and or for combined heat and power, which will then generate electricity for your site. You've got things like air source and ground source heat pumps, which again, that's really boomed in the last few years, where basically there's certain conditions in which they're ideal and certain conditions in which they're not really as appropriate or as efficient as they can be. And I've got cleverer colleagues than me that can explain the perfect conditions for that particular technology. But there are technologies out there and they are constantly evolving. I remember solar panels at the outset they were very expensive, they were very heavy. A lot of roofs weren't suitable for them because of the weight of them, but they've become a lot more lightweight. They're increasingly efficient and they last, anything up to 20 years. So they're generally thought to be a good investment. The yield you get from solar will depend on the pitch of the roof and your position in the country and a number of other factors, shading, and of course, the amount of roof space you have. But you can also get elevated solar, which can be ground mounted. You've probably seen it when you've been abroad, maybe in this country, where you've got car park canopies, for instance, which are solar. BP had them on some of their retail stations. Their canopies were covered in solar panels. But yeah, it's horses for courses. OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, will always tell you their technology is best and it's going to be wonderful and don't worry about it. Our job is to make sure that that's the case and we'll validate it from a technological, commercial and operational perspective on your behalf. Next slide, please. But it's not all about technologies. A lot of people, particularly those that are tasked with managing energy, are typically engineers, and engineers that love nothing than a tangible project, a bit of mechanics, this nice black box sitting in the corner of the site and spending good money on it. But the easy stuff is the behavior change, the people and processes. That's where you're going to get your low cost, biggest bang for your buck. This is about making sure that, one, the starting point is understanding your energy data, making sure that it's reliable and it's robust, you understand it, you interpret it, and you act upon it. So in other words, it can identify hotspots, it can identify where things are being left on, where they shouldn't be, overnight, for instance. Or in one case, I remember working with McVitie's a number of years ago, and over the Christmas period, the engineering manager, who was the seventh guy to go in for a 4-hour shift, so there'd been 6 people before him, he spent literally 4 hours going around switching things off, and he was the 7th person in there. Now, that tells you 2 things. One, there's no focus and there's no culture around energy on that site, period. This wasn't about technology, this is about people and processes, people taking responsibility. So you've all heard of behavior change, I'm sure, and it's quite simple. I mean, in my household, I raised my son, and it was quite simple with him, because when he was called down for his dinner and I could still hear his PlayStation whirring away, I'd send him back up to turn it off and turn his bedroom light off. I only had to do that a few times, and he knew it was always going to happen, and he started to do it habitually. And it's exactly the same in the workplace. It doesn't matter what the work environment is. It's about having those constant, gentle reminders, and it's a cumulative effect of those little things that make a big impact on energy consumption. And once you change the culture and the mindset of people in the organization, it's changed forever. And you'll find that you get that downward trend in terms of energy consumption, which is brilliant. But as I say, that's the low cost, easy to, well, it's not necessarily easy to do, but it's your starting point. Before you leap to projects and spending capital that you probably haven't got or you don't want to spend, think about how you currently manage energy and how you can improve that. Okay, next slide, please. And of course, don't ignore your scope 3 emissions. By all means, focus initially on scope 1, scope 2, but at some point very soon, you're going to have to start tackling scope 3. And the starting point, as I said earlier, when we do our gap analysis, is to do an expenditure-based analysis of your supply chain, because that's where the bulk of your scope 3 emissions are coming from. And even if you simply engage your key suppliers, your main emitters, and ask them for information, say, I need to start reporting what my emissions are from the things you're supplying to me. Can you tell me per unit of product, per kilogram of product, per litre of product, whatever it may be, what are the CO2 emissions from that product you're supplying me? Now, you'll be surprised. Some of your suppliers will already be doing that for others, and they'll easily be able to give it to you. Others will say, okay, we didn't realize you needed it. We'll start collecting it. How do you want it? What format? How often? And they'll start doing it. And then you'll get the odd supplier that'll go, no, not going to do that. And then you have a choice to make at some point. Do I continue with that supplier? Is there an alternative that I can use that is more cooperative and will help me to reduce my overall scope 3 emissions? So it's not as daunting as people think, but it is important to be aware, and it is important to make a start, because it is about the future of your business. I think that's the last slide. Oh, okay, no, I beg your pardon. I've turned that off. One of the other questions we do get asked is, well, once we've understood what our overall emissions are, can't we just simply offset them? Yeah, you can, but it's not credible and it won't stand up to scrutiny. So if you're involved in TCFD or anything else, your investors won't approve of that. They will choose not to invest in your business. Employees will choose not to work for you. It'll be difficult to attract new customers because it's basically not credible. The Science Based Target Initiative, which is backed by the UN and other large NGOs, their view of offsetting is there is a place for it. And I agree, there is a place for offsetting. So that's the emissions you can't easily get rid of. So let's say at the moment, that might be 90% of your current emissions you might not be able to get rid of at this point, because technology doesn't allow it. Your processes doesn't allow you to. You're still emitting 90% of what you've always emitted. But over time, that will reduce, because as your suppliers reduce their emissions, that brings down your scope 3. As new technologies come into place, that will bring down your emissions as well. So over time, your emissions will come down. But at various points, there's going to be that residual bunch of emissions that you can't get rid of. Even when you get to 2050, that may be that there are still emissions we cannot eradicate. And at that point, or at any point along the journey, you can choose to offset those emissions. But if you do it, you've got to do it in a credible way through someone like Gold Standard or Small Woodlands Trust or someone like that. This isn't just about planting trees. You know, it's got to be a credible scheme. I remember probably about 3-4 years ago, the Turkish government saying that over a weekend, they had planted 100 million trees, okay? 1 year later, 90 million of those trees were dead, because they have to be the right trees. They have to be the right trees in the right the right species, and they have to be managed. You know, you can't just plant trees and leave them to it. Even in this country, it has to be managed woodland. So even if you think, oh, planting a tree is the answer, no, it's not. It's not as simple as that at all. But there are other ways in which you can do it as well, and you can actually choose to do something called insetting, which is where you take your residual emissions and you take the equivalent offsetting cost of that, and you choose to invest that money in your supply chain. So it could be one of your suppliers could have solar panels on his roof, but they can't afford it. But you choose to invest that money. That reduces your scope 3 emissions. It reduces his scope 2 emissions. So it's a bit of a win-win, and it also helps you to, you know, realize a better relationship with your suppliers. So there's different ways of doing it, but no, you can't just simply offset your emissions. And I think hopefully it should be on the question slide. Yeah, I've talked about that. So next slide, I think, is questions. Okay, so in summary, yeah, definitely I would encourage you to see net zero as a commercial opportunity, not as a threat. It's only a threat if you choose to do nothing about it. And it'll become increasingly a threat as time goes by. Take one step at a time. It seems daunting. It's not. We can help you to get there, or just take it, concentrate on your scope 1, scope 2 to begin with, because that's going to have an immediate cost benefit to you. But very much start working on your scope 3 and start talking to your suppliers. Understand what your emissions are as a business, because trust me, if you're not already being asked it by your clients, you soon will be. And law dictates you'll have to, and increased reporting means that you will have to start reporting it, measuring it, and doing something about it. And most importantly, have a plan. It doesn't have to be complex, but just have a plan. Start to understand what it is you're going to do, when you're going to do it. And within that, set yourself realistic targets. You know, I've engaged organizations, or been engaged by organizations that said, right, a couple of years ago when net zero first came on the scene, we've declared a net zero target of 2035. Okay, great, that's plausible, but how? Why did you arrive at that target? Well, we just think that morally we need to get there. But you haven't done any homework. You don't understand whether that's achievable, or if you've now declared it, you have to achieve it. How are you going to do that? That's going to cost you an awful lot of money in a very short period of time. And you know what? You're going to have to do an awful lot of offsetting or insetting, because the technologies are not there yet to enable you to offset or to take out a lot of these emissions. So do your homework first. That's the important thing, and set realistic targets for your particular organization. And collaborate. You know, you're not doing this thing on your own. Talk to experts. You know, if you can't afford to bring in people like ourselves, you know, just talk to each other, talk to other people that you can see are already on that journey, have already just started to do stuff, learn from others, and seek expert help where needed. Yeah, there's always a cost to that. Obviously there is, but you know, don't try and do it on your own if you don't have the skills, the time, the knowledge, or the tools to do it. You know, there are people out there that can help you. There are you know, sources of information. Webinars like this are designed to share knowledge and to help people. We have fact sheets and, you know, recordings of webinars and all sorts of things, and others do the same thing. And most importantly, with all your stakeholders and with yourselves, be open and transparent about what you're doing. You know, no one expects anyone to be able to become net zero overnight, and anyone that's claiming to be so are lying. Period. They're lying, because it's not possible at the moment. But what is possible is to make those first steps and start on that journey, because the sooner you do it, the easier it's going to be, and the less expensive it's going to be. Okay, that's it. Questions?
Thank you very much, George. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And we do have some questions, actually. So I am very conscious of the time, because I would like to make sure that we finish at 12 o'clock, but we do have some questions. The first question is from James. You mentioned SECR and EOS being legislative requirements. Try saying that with your teeth in. Is TCFD a legislative requirement for businesses?
It is, but only for large businesses at the moment. So it's those that I think turn over £500 million or more, or employ more than 500 people. The point being is, though, that for those big businesses, they will then be passing some of that down. So they'll be replicating some of the questions, and some of the demands on them will be passed on through their own supply chains. So this, whilst that particular legislation only applies to that size of business, there will be implications, ramifications for their own supply chains, many of whom will be SMEs, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Thank you very much, George. Paul's asked a very good question, which is, are there any software or tools available for organizations to collect data? You know, is there anything you can recommend to organizations?
There's a number of tools out there. They're called ESG tools. So there are tools that only measure carbon or carbon equivalent impacts of GHGs, and there are other tools which are ESG auditing tools. We're currently developing one with a company called ClearChain, which will continually audit your entire supply chain, both from a carbon perspective and also from an ESG perspective. By ESG, I mean the social aspects. So things like you might have called CSR in the past. So it's about bribery, anti-slavery, corruption, all those sorts of things. So on top of, and those things have been asked for many, many times, and I'm sure anyone that's supplied to any of the big companies will be asked for all of those policies. So this is a way of being able to audit any of your suppliers on a regular basis and know exactly where they're at and where your risks are and who your biggest impactors are.
Fantastic, thank you. No, that's great. And putting you slightly on the spot here, George, but Robert has asked a question, and again, I think this is a great question. If there was one place where an SME could start this journey, where would you say is there one key thing that they could do to start this roadmap journey for them?
Understand your current position. So understand what your emissions are at this point, and then start with your scope 1, scope 2, because that'll have a financial benefit to you straight away, which is important, because there's no point in having a net zero plan if you go out of business. Absolutely pointless. Although your emissions will be zero, you won't be in business. So, let's be practical about this. That we've got to survive first of all.
Absolutely. No, that's great. That's you've got to know where you are, haven't you, before you can begin anything. Absolutely. That's great. Thank you so much, George. I think that ends the questions, but if anybody does have any other questions, we will be providing our contact details at the end, so please do feel free to email myself or George with any questions, and we will come back to you with any answers in relation to that. And as I said, the recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so we will send that out to you. It just leaves me really to say thank you so much, George. I do think that was incredibly interesting. I have learned lots during that. I think I wholeheartedly support what you're saying, that it is everybody's responsibility. This isn't about I love the phrase you used, the tree hugging. This is everybody's responsibility, both individually and collectively. Use it as an opportunity for your organization to differentiate yourself from your competitors. And as George said, there is plenty of help and guidance out there to handhold you through that process. You are not alone.